So now we're going to be going into the simultaneous sessions. On this stage, we're going to be having a session on models for net zero value chains. For those of you who will be going to the decarbonizing trade systems, that's going to be in the pathways stage. And at the same time, also, we have the facilitating a nuclear-powered net zero future, which will be on the transformation stage. We're just going to be setting up here quickly, and we'll be starting in just a minute. So please feel free to move to the stages that you need, or stick around for a great panel on models for net zero value chains. Thanks very much. So, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started with the next session here, which is models for net zero value chains, infrastructure, interconnectivity, and finance. My name is Phillip Cornell. I'm the head of global energy and sustainability for Economist Impact, which many people might have known previously as the Economist Intelligence Unit. And it's really a pleasure for me to welcome today's panel. In the race to, please let's sit down.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Please. And why don't you just sort of go on the end here, please?
Okay.
So thanks very much. It's great to be here. In the race to get to a net zero economy, companies, industries are really grappling with implementation. So how to decarbonize not only their own businesses and activities up and down the value chain, but also how to address Scope 3 emissions. They typically account for about 2/3 of corporate emissions and are often much more within energy value chains. And delivering on them remains a really big challenge. So from data structures to supplier communications to improved efficiency, decarbonizing inputs, and financing decarbonization among supply chain partners, cleaning up the whole value chain is tough work. So how can green investment trends and industry expertise be leveraged to build the foundations for low carbon business models? So I'm really excited to discuss all of this with our exceptional panel. So next to me, Christian Bruch is President and Chief Executive Officer of Siemens Energy. Lorenzo Simonelli is Chairman and President and CEO of Baker Hughes. Marisa is Chief Sustainability Officer of Standard Chartered Bank. Andrew Herscowitz is Chief Development Officer of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC. And finally, Fahad Alajlan is President of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, CAPSARC. So welcome to everybody. Maybe what I can do is start with Fahad, if I might. You know, at CAPSARC, we're obviously in a region here where it is marked by significant growth. And so developing value chains and net zero value chains is something that we're really on the forefront here. But it's happening within a very specific context. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what does decarbonizing net zero value chains mean here? What are some of the challenges and what's the context that you're looking at?
Thank you, Philip, and it's a pleasure to be here in Abu Dhabi and UAE in such a significant year with COP28, and I would like to congratulate His Excellency Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber for being named the president of COP28. I think it's very timely, and maybe you start here in UAE and Abu Dhabi. I think UAE and Abu Dhabi has demonstrated this focus about infrastructure and the large-scale infrastructure that would make net zero models available and accessible, as well as cost efficient. When we were looking at examples that have been done here in enhanced oil recovery and CCUS, it's this mindset and this infrastructure and focus on long-term investment that has enabled the region in UAE, but also in Saudi, to actually develop and take the lead, try to take the lead. I think we've seen this in Saudi. Saudi Arabia has designated Jubail Industrial City, which is responsible for 10% of Saudi Arabia's emission, as a CCS as well as a hydrogen hub. And by leveraging all of this, concentration of industry, but also concentration of knowledge, wealth of experience, having the companies being there, they're leveraging all of that scale to develop the infrastructure that is needed to actually make this investment at scale. And so, for example, Saudi has announced that Jubail will have a CCS capacity of 9 million tons by 2027, but the target is 45 million tons by 2035. The same thing for hydrogen. By designating Jubail as a hydrogen city, where there is an expectation of developing blue hydrogen or hydrogen from gas with CCS, you're building the synergies between CCS and hydrogen industry. And having the infrastructure, because we understand the need for infrastructure, including port, power plant, electricity plants, and so by leveraging all of that synergy, you're able to build infrastructure at scale and at a cost that is competitive.
Thanks very much. I mean, maybe, Lorenzo, I can turn to you. I mean, we talked a little bit about the infrastructure and the upstream infrastructure. Clearly, this is a place where Baker Hughes is very active, particularly on the services side. Can you tell us a little bit about how do we sort of decarbonize that value chain up the chain, particularly when it comes to, for example, issues like efficiency?
Definitely, and firstly, it's great to be here, and Philip, thank you for the question. And I think as you look at efficiency, it's the biggest driver and opportunity we have today to actually reduce emissions. And if you look at the IEA study, 40% of the achieved goal towards the Paris Agreement can be done by efficiency in the way in which we utilize infrastructure that's there today and also drive productivity, which means it's a double win. Number one, we can actually reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, but we can also improve the productivity and the efficiency of the bottom line of the companies. At Baker Hughes, we're an energy technology company, which means we focus on really areas where our equipment and the services that we provide can actually be upgraded, can be more reliable, can be more efficient. And there's plenty of examples out there where today we have emissions taking place that shouldn't take place. To name a few, flaring. Flaring is something that is very common, and today you can eliminate flaring. And that is a big gain with regards to efficiency as well as to reducing the carbon footprint. When you look at valves, so there's an estimate that about 46% of the emissions of methane are leaks within pneumatic valves. Well, valves exist today that actually have no leaks. And in fact, we're one of the suppliers of those valves. And so you can actually start to change out some of the infrastructure. Likewise, on turbines, and I'm sure also Christian will talk about this as well, but turbines can be upgraded, and there's software packages that can be implemented that reduce the emissions by improving the performance and the efficiency. So you go through really the life cycle of a facility, and there's plenty of opportunities through technology that's here today to actually drive down the CO2 footprint. And I think we don't do enough about implementing the solutions we have today. And it's where we need to start, because then as technology develops, we'll get to hydrogen, we'll get to the different energy mix of the future. But here and now, let's actually deploy the capabilities we have and drive that efficiency.
So deploying the capabilities we have and using the infrastructure we have, maybe Christian, I can turn to you. I know that at Siemens Energy, part of the sort of 5 principles that you have for energy transition includes using and utilizing existing infrastructures kind of as a bridge. Could you talk a little bit about those 5 points and how they relate to decarbonizing the value chains?
Yeah, and first of all, thanks very much also for having me on this panel. And I mean, these are 5 points where we say these are particularly important. There's a lot more points to make energy transition happen. But similar to what Lorenzo just was saying, one principle is drive efficiency of these 5 points, and I will come to the other 4 in a second. But why is it important? Because one thing, as Lorenzo said, yes, there's a massive amount of potential, but we also, let's say, need to make use of the time we have. While we transition to a new energy infrastructure, we will need to make sure that we get a handle on the problem right away. And this will be very much driven by energy efficiency, and this is why it's so important. The other key point, without any question, is obviously build out renewables as fast as possible. Easier said than done sometimes. We have to put it into perspective. Today, we easily talk about, 25% of the electricity production globally is renewable. But we have to keep one thing in mind. Half of it is hydro, which you cannot really scale. So actually, the technologies what you can scale, solar and wind, is only a good 10% of the global electricity production. If you want to get to 90 or whatever, right, you know how much you have to speed up. So build it out as fast as possible is necessary. The second element is if you do this, you will need more electricity transmission grids. This is why the electrical grid infrastructure build out is a second key element. And just to give an example, as Lorenzo was giving the example of the valve, we just signed on Friday an agreement for the next phase to build out the electricity infrastructure in Iraq. 40% of the electricity generated in Iraq gets lost in the transmission grid. So great if you can get CO2 down in the generation, but if you lose 40% while getting it to the point of use, that is a big problem. So transmission grids are the second element. Definitely the third point for us is always this efficiency, as Lorenzo pointed out, and the fourth element is for us using existing infrastructure. The amount of money which we have to employ into the new infrastructure will be enormous. It's a massive opportunity, but we have, as economies, be also very sensible with the money we spend. And this is why using existing infrastructure, optimizing turbines, decarbonizing them, making them more efficient, introduce hydrogen combustion, makes really sense simply because we have to make sure we don't end up with billions and billions of stranded assets and use them. And underlying all these points is we need a new minerals and materials strategy. The amount of minerals and materials we will need is unprecedented. The world is not set up for this supply chain. We are just about to run into these problems now, and we're going to see 3, 4, 5 years down the road big constraints, even if we would not have trade conflicts. One way or the other, we will be short on minerals and materials, and this is why we need a very clear and decent strategy on how to tackle minerals, which includes recycling.
And I think the issue of materials and mineral supply chains really brings us further up to the supply chain and into regions where sometimes either the data collection or communication might not be as built out and developed as it is in some of other places. So maybe, Marisa, I can move to you. Standard Chartered works very much in sort of developing and emerging economies. But we heard both from Christian about the question of finance financing
Sure.
and all the money that this is going to take. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about, the investment, what kind of information and transparency we need to mobilize the investment that's necessary, and how you attain that and work in these environments to get that.
Sure. So in some respects, I think finance bridges a lot of what we're talking about here. So on the one hand, it's the energy transition. How do we fund that transition? How do we fund the investment in the renewables, the alternative energy sources? How do we fund smart infrastructure? And how do we fund process improvement? And then lastly, how do we fund the new and emergent technologies, whether it's CCS or green hydrogen? I mean, we sit at the center of all of that, and we're involved in all of that. When we think about the supply chain, I think historically we've operated in some respects in discrete silos. So each company has its own patch. And I think what we're realizing now is that we need to be connected across the entire value chain in order to actually maximize efficiency and synergy. And so we're deep at work trying to help make that happen. And we're looking start to finish in everything. And sometimes it's a little tweak. I mean, we've got a project financing of undersea cables that's working with TAQA and ADNOC to decarbonize in some respects the platforms by getting rid of diesel generators, connecting them to the grid, and the grid is powered partly by renewable energy. That's a small tweak financing. Then we've got big tweak financing, or big financings, like a project which has been announced, which is the first sustainable supply chain for the region. There, what we're focused on is a common set of KPIs and understanding so that everybody who's participating in the supply chain, and this is geared toward the retail sector, is understanding what we mean when we say sustainable. Because if one part of your supply chain at the very, very end of a retail company where something is produced in an emerging market is not understanding sustainability the way you are at the interface of the customer, we've got a problem. And so to your point, in some of the markets that we operate in, it's still very early days. So Standard Chartered operates in 59 footprint markets. In 33 of those markets, the countries that we're banking either have a net zero commitment that is beyond 2050, or they don't have one at all. So in some respects, what we're doing is we're trying to push these countries and the operators within those countries faster than they're prepared to go, but we need that sense of urgency is there to try to bring them along. So we are doing that through information sharing. We're doing that from sharing best practice, and we're doing that through the provision of capital and setting standards.
Right. And obviously in these kind of markets where sort of mitigation of risk is important, Andrew, this is obviously a place where DFC is playing a role as well. So particularly in those places where, perhaps the net zero aspect of the value chain might be relatively nascent, it might be early in the journey. Can you just tell us a little bit about the role of public financing in those kind of markets and what DFC is doing to support sort of financing?
So DFC is the U.S. government's development finance institution, which was established just about 3 years ago, replaced OPIC, but we're the equivalent of IFC, but we're the U.S. government, and we offer all tools from debt to guarantees, technical assistance, equity investments as well. But I want to draw a little bit on what Amos was talking about during the fireside chat, because when we talk about net zero value chains, there's one thing to talk about the greening of the supply chain, but there's another thing to talk about the supply chain that you're going to need to achieve net zero. And when you talk about achieving net zero and a net zero value chain, you can't talk about it without also considering what is a clean supply chain. One thing that we're all terrible at doing is learning from our mistakes. We were ill prepared for COVID, even though we knew that a pandemic was coming. We're watching what's happened with gas as a result of the Ukraine crisis. And Amos was just warning everybody, saying this isn't about the US and China, it's about everybody in China. And the lesson that we can draw on, and it wasn't China suddenly choking the supply on solar panels, but voluntarily, a lot of us decided that we needed to slow down some of our solar investments as we were seeing that the polysilicon that was being manufactured coming out of China, you had a tainted supply chain. It was 70% of the polysilicon in the world. And we couldn't clearly know that we weren't buying panels, or the projects we were financing were using panels that weren't being made with some sort of forced labor. So voluntarily, that slowed down what we were doing. That drove us as DFC into looking about how we can diversify our supply chain. One of the things that we did is we provided First Solar, a US company with $500 million to build out manufacturing of thin film panels, which don't use polysilicon in India, but clearly try to step up our game to make sure that as we move forward to try to achieve net zero, we need to make sure that we have a clean supply chain, one that we can all look at. Now imagine if China, the PRC, suddenly decided to cut off the supply chain, then it's involuntarily we're not able to do what we all think that we're going to achieve. It's no different than what's happening with Russia in Ukraine with the gas supply. So it's absolutely critical that all of us are playing a role in diversifying the supply chain. Now we can look, and this is part of what DFC is doing, we have a $10 billion portfolio in Africa. We want to grow that substantially, but we need to think through what we can do to help diversify that supply chain and also green existing manufacturing as well. Whether it's moving manufacturing of the key inputs to Africa, you look at a lot of the key inputs for the renewable supply chain, the resources are located in Africa, right? So is Africa just going to be the supplier of the cobalt and of the nickel and of the lithium, or are they actually going to be part of the entire value chain? And we all have to play a role in making sure that it's not all being processed in PRC and that we're playing a key role in diversifying that value chain.
Thanks. I mean, I think that really highlights sort of the strategic nature of some of the minerals value chains that you were talking about, Christian. And you know, when we talk about how we address sort of issues in those specific countries, it's really about partnerships, isn't it? And I know Siemens has done a lot sort of looking at public-private partnerships, partnering with ARENA, for example. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the experience and the sort of the requirements in that area.
Yeah, so two things. We just had it yesterday here also in Assembly with something we created on COP27, which is called the Decarbonization Alliance, which particularly addresses, obviously, decarbonizing all the hard-to-abate industries and really help together with. So we brought so far together a good 30 companies. We're obviously growing relatively fast. And the key intention is really, on the one hand, share really experiences to make sure you can implement similar project setups to decarbonize in similar industries, so that really we get this sharing platforms, but also addressing elements like the financing and the human capital. That is sometimes we very rarely talk about. What is a human capital, a part of the resources we do require to build all this stuff, to engineer all this stuff, and to operate all this stuff. The intention is really obviously to accelerate it, but also to make it more tangible. One frustration I have, obviously, from all, let's say, the discussions that we're having. We talk about it, we do pledges, and we somewhat do not able to really accelerate it. And what we are trying to do as industry partners is to formulate more specifically what is required in the changes of the boundary conditions for policymakers to do to get up the speed. We see at the moment fantastic examples for realizing, decarbonizing, or renewable type of projects, but we have to be aware this is under today's boundary conditions. If we want to accelerate it by a factor of 5 or by a factor of 10, boundary conditions need to be changed. And then we as corporates, we as financing institutions, then we need to define what needs to be different. Why is this project on green hydrogen not bankable, right? Why does it not fly? And this is where the other thing of this alliance is, bringing the people together who are willing to step up, having a louder voice and saying, we as an industry are part of the solution. And in this regard, I also really applaud the leadership team, which is now coming together at COP28, because I think that is a clear intention on COP28 also to say, yes, we want industry to play a key role in the COP discussion, which, as you know, had not always been the part. But we're coming all together from policymakers, companies, other players' side. I mean, this change is so big. Partnership is the underlying foundation for that.
Yeah, and particularly on the policy side, I mean, when we talk about changing those boundary conditions, Fahad, this is sort of a region where that's happening at very high speed. That will certainly be highlighted at COP28, but both the UAE and Saudi are making big changes on that front. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I mean, within the context of some of the sort of rapid national transformation, what are those policy boundary conditions that really need to be attacked here?
So I would like to highlight that this is probably the region that invented mega and giga projects. So I think people like to think about, large and huge scale projects. And so when we see this for example, in the example of the UAE has announced a very ambitious plan to actually expand their oil production. Yet they're also, committed to a net zero model. They're committed to reducing their emissions from the oil and gas sector. And we talked about renewable, we talked about CCS, and so on. I think this is happening in Saudi, this is happening in Qatar as well, which are countries that are doing this. But I think it's important that we copy the same model to areas that are not happening. When we see Iraq with the huge flaring that is coming from gas, and yet Iraq is in need for, gas for electricity. I think that's where we need to make sure that these lessons learned, these business models are then implemented in other regions. I think we always talk about the energy side, and I think the energy side is important, but I think energy is used to, implementing things at scale. I think we need to also talk about the other sector that are not used to this. And if we're talking about the agriculture sector, if we're talking about the, waste sector, what are we doing? There's no ADNOC, there is no Saudi Aramco there. And so the policymaker need to make sure that they address this. Saudi Arabia has, set an ambitious plan of recycling 94% of waste. It's a huge ambition. And I think we need to have those, large-scale projects happening in the agriculture sector and the waste sector and other sector. Because I think energy, we've seen that we have very sophisticated policymaker, but it's also sophisticated player with the ADNOC and Saudi Aramco and SABIC and Siemens and Baker Hughes of the world contributing to achieving this. There is an issue with technology, there is an issue with financing, there is an issue with regulation and standard and verification, but it's being addressed, I think, at the energy sector. I think we need to look at other sectors and what can we copy from the energy sector and use in those other sectors to push them forward. Because emissions does not distinguish if it's coming from an oil and gas well or from a landfill. And so we need to make sure that we are addressing all economic sector, all economic activities to reduce and manage emissions.
Yeah, certainly. And if we're thinking about particularly downstream emissions, scope 3 emissions from the energy sector, they're really coming out in a lot of the areas and sectors that you're mentioning, for example, like agriculture. I think both Fahad and Christian, you both touched on this issue of human capital, expertise, and knowledge. Lorenzo, I know sort of as a service provider, working as a supplier with lots of different companies, you have gained this particular level of expertise that you're then able to share both with your clients and with stakeholders in the industry. Can you talk us a little bit about your role in that, in sort of developing and spreading expertise?
Definitely, and I think when you look at the energy transition, and we look at it from a standpoint of feasibility of the energy transition being a success. Tick one, technology is there. If anybody says that technology isn't there, we already have a huge amount of capability, as I mentioned before, to drive efficiency. It's just implementing the technology at scale and getting it out there. Financing is available. It just requires the agreements of off-takes to be made, and we know that natural gas can play a huge role. When it comes to human capital, that's the area where we really need to work together in collaboration. And we don't have enough of the human capital today to be able to do all of the projects that are necessary. And that's an area where collaboration, and it's not any one sector, it's the sectors working together. It's both governments, it's also private businesses, it's NGOs coming together and actually creating that ecosystem that allows for the collaboration for these projects to go forward. And that's why I think COP28 is going to be the first time where truly everybody is welcome. And when you look at what's been stated as it being an important arena for everybody to have the topics and the hard discussions, because Scope 1, 2, Scope 3, it's all interrelated. And agriculture is interrelated with energy, is interrelated with transportation, and this is a complicated ecosystem that requires a lot of human capital and a lot of collaboration.
Yeah. Maybe, Marisa, we can stick to this theme, right,
sure,
of partnerships and building expertise throughout the value chain. How do you see it, and what's the role that you think for finance institutions?
Well, certainly I think I have to say I'm optimistic. here and now, because I really do see, you said COP28 will be the time when we all come together. That's exactly what we need, because if we sit around and think about a complex problem, it's not going to be solved by one actor. It's got to be all of us coming together and saying, where do we bring expertise and lend that to the table to unlock particular hurdles? We see this all the time in finance. There's an automatic assumption that because this project or this technology seems good, then all the money will flow. But there have to be certain enabling conditions. Some of that's policy making, so those incentives actually really drive capital investment, because then you understand that that technology can get there and scale. In other cases, we actually need a kickstart. We need some catalytic capital that might be concessionary, and we will partner very often with our friends in the developing bank world, whether it be to provide concessionary capital or to provide a credit wrapper, something that will enhance the ability for the private sector money to flow. But when we're all talking the same language, as opposed to each making assumptions about what the other brings to the table, then great things can happen. One of the things that we're seeing right now, a very good case example that came out of COP27, was the concept of the just energy transition partnerships. And this is where capital from Western governments will be applied to developing markets that are largely reliant on high carbon emitting industries as our primary source of energy. We need to get some of these developing markets to move very fast. They may not have the capacity, they may not have the human capital that is equipped yet to participate in these industries, and they need just the money to flow to actually compensate, for instance, if we want to say early decommissioning. How do you compensate the country at a systemic level if you're telling them get off coal now and replace it with something else that's got an investment cycle? What do you do in the interim? How do you find jobs for the people who are going to come out of coal? We've got to train them. There's a transition period. But I think if you look at it systemically and holistically, and you bring public, private, government, industry together, you can crack the code. And that's what I think is going to be happening in the very near future. And that gets us very excited. And we stand by to underwrite those opportunities.
Andrew, I mean, Marisa touched on some really important parts there. Obviously, the impact on jobs is a politically sensitive issue in the course of the transition. DFC and development banks, what is sort of the role, and what are you doing to attack that and to build that kind of capacity?
So let's just start with DFC has a priority of creating new jobs, and that's, you look at particularly the African continent, the growth to have about 2.4 billion people. In the not too distant future, and you look at the largest metropolises in the world are going to be based, I think 11 out of 20 are going to be based in Africa. But I want to touch a little bit on what Lorenzo was saying. We talk about value chains. I mean, we can talk about the importance of diversifying value chains. It's one thing to say it's important to do, another thing to figure out how do you actually do it. And what are the pieces that make that happen? And so you think about a market like Africa, which will have 2.4 billion people. All of the trade barriers hopefully will get broken down so that you can view it as one market instead of 50 different countries with its own rules. Unfortunately, what you see in a lot of the developing world is it's easier and less expensive to get goods from a country in that region to the US or to the PRC than it is to get it to the neighboring country. And so you've got to break all of that down. You have to reduce the cost because value chains are just incredibly price sensitive, and they need to have that competitive edge. I was just recently in Benin and Togo, and I learned, and I should have known this because I've covered the region for a long time, about the deep water ports that are in Togo, and just what the population center is going to be when you stretch going from Abidjan to Lagos, the number of people that are going to be there. So you have incredible opportunity to be extremely, extremely competitive. But then when you don't have political will, and both of these countries now do have political will to do things differently, but between countries, when you see the border between Benin and Nigeria getting closed because there's really kind of a fight between two billionaires who aren't happy that goods are getting across the border, you've got to get past all of that stuff. You've got to figure out how to create the political will and make sure, because honestly, like the way that we've seen wages increasing in PRC is going to price itself out of being competitive over time just because of its own economic growth. So the last major market with inexpensive labor is going to be in Africa. So we collectively have to figure out how we can play a role in supporting the development of industries in there. I think a lot of people in this room have probably never done business there. And it's just, it seems to be like a, you know, there's a lot of perception of risk. And a lot of the risk is real, but there's incredible, incredible opportunity. And if we're only thinking about right now as opposed to 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we're going to miss out on that opportunity.
Would anyone like to speak also to that question of how do we actually mitigate risk in some of those developing markets?
Yeah, I think first of all we have to recognize that, we are doing a lot of business in Africa, and we are obviously involved in terms of electrifying some of these countries, and you see how different and how difficult it is and where you start. It's about energy resilience, it's about access to electricity and energy, and I think we have to first of all recognize how different the regions globally are to tackle these type of problems. I do agree there's a massive potential also seeing the human capital, but we also have to calibrate it a little bit. Where do we are today? And the biggest risk is actually that we don't get the funds going to actually do what is needed to develop these type of societies. And we have to be aware there it's less about private capital. It's really about support, governmental money. The biggest share in the investment into infrastructure comes there from the governmental side. That's different from Europe or Middle East or the US or so, where you can, let's say, let flow a lot of the private capital of the companies. In Africa, this doesn't work. And that is a general risk, that we have this continuous detachment. And we all talk about it. There was a 100 billion pledge and whatever, and it all didn't happen, right? And things are not moving.
Yeah, but this is what Secretary Kerry said this morning.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk, we have to actually put the money there. And that's the role of public institutions like DFC. DFC is not OPIC in a couple of key ways. One, we don't only finance US companies anymore. Our mandate is development and foreign policy. Number two, we don't have to earn a return. We do. We want to do bankable projects, but our mandate isn't to earn a large return. It's to make sure we're advancing development and foreign policy. We're the only one amongst all the development finance institutions that I'm aware of that doesn't have to borrow money from capital markets or earn a certain return, and we're just growing into that now. And every other public institution, honestly, should be modeled after us moving forward. Because otherwise we're playing too close to the game of what commercial banks are doing, and we're not playing the role that we were designed to play, which is to fill this gap, to help companies like Baker Hughes and Siemens take on a little bit more risk and go into these markets.
Yeah.
Can I also add one more thing, just to bring a different lens to this, is that another thing that we all are looking at, or we need to look at, and we are certainly looking at Standard Chartered, is how do we think about the asset quality that exists in a country in a different way? So you look at a continent like Africa, rich with natural resources. If we can help the country monetize through carbon credits those beautiful natural assets, that can help pay for some of this. Because part of the problem is this assumption that, you know, this is the purview of the private sector, this is the purview of development funding banks, or this is the purview of government. A lot of times those lines are a bit fuzzy, just to your very point. But the governments themselves, if there's an assumption that they've got all this capital lying around, in a lot of these developing markets, they don't. And that capital's allocated to something else. And if we really want to push the green agenda, let's help the green agenda fund the green agenda within the country. But we need to do that in a very rigorous way. We need to make sure that that money goes back to the country and not somewhere else. And that's where things like the Integrity Council, the voluntary carbon markets, is hard at work. But I do think that holds some promise for us as part of the equation.
Yeah.
I think there's a word that we don't use often enough, being practical. And as we go through this, there's a lot of things we already know. The way in which the United States and Europe managed to reduce its carbon footprint over the course of the last few decades is by shifting from coal to natural gas. Natural gas is here today, it's available. And from a practical energy transition standpoint, we also have to have a dialogue that says, how do you go in phases? And I think it was said also yesterday, natural gas is transition and destination fuel. And it is much less carbon intensive than coal. And we know how we can make gas cleaner and how we can stop methane leaks. So I think also as you look at Africa and you look at these areas, we should be helping them develop their natural resources where it makes sense and actually utilize what's available here today as we continue through the next decades to get to the other side of an energy mix that is different. But I think sometimes we don't have the right conversations around being practical in the approach. And we've seen it done before, so we can learn from the past.
I just have to make an announcement for everybody here. For anyone who perceives that DFC will not finance gas projects, we will finance gas projects. Make that clear. It's one of the reasons that I'm here, is to see what we can do.
Yeah, and I think sort of this question about how international public or public financing deals with fossil fuels is one that's alive and well. I mean, you brought up sort of Secretary Kerry's remarks. I think he also said no government has enough money to solve this problem on its own. So it's really about how we then can use those tools to leverage all of the private financing that's necessary and de-risk it in some of those markets. So I wonder, as we talk, I mean, Dr. Sultan also on the first day yesterday was mentioning the need for reform of some multilateral development banks. Maybe Marisa, what do you think are some of the key roles that you need to see those kind of institutions playing to make sure that private capital can start to flow?
Well, I think the DFC is a great example of an organization that has reformed, is in the process of reforming. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but I do remember conversations not that long ago, which was my mandate was people development, and it still is. But when you brought climate as the vehicle for people development, that somehow was getting lost in the equation. It was sort of climate's not my mandate's the people, and now I look and climate's squarely in the heart of your mandate. I think that's a reformed way of thinking. I also think in the old world, you know, my background's capital markets, and we would sit in these rooms and the development funding banks are said, my patch is here, and the minute something could be commercially viable, I must step back and then you private sector folks get in. Blended finance is this new term of art where in the same project, you can have a development funding bank providing one layer of capital and the private sector providing another, and those two are actually additive to each other in the same project or capital stack. Those are new ways of thinking, and I think more of that is quite useful. But to me, a lot of this is this mandate that development funding isn't climate. Now these things are intertwined, and I think we need more of that. So that then, I think these development funding institutions are a proxy for governments. They can be sitting, as we sit in these rooms, and you say, if we just had this tweak to this rule or law or policy, the capital will flow. It's those conversations that can be actionable, and sometimes that goes right back up through the development funding institutions to get that done. And sometimes it's the rest of us putting a little pressure on those governments. Or you have a very progressive government that says, please tell me what the problem is. I want to be a force for good. So all of those I think are important.
But if I may add one point, because also, first of all, Andrew, many thanks for making such a statement, because one risk what I see in the financing industry, and maybe it's getting now a little bit more clear, the discussion, is that we have a black and white discussion. There's good and bad technologies, there's good and bad projects. Energy transition gets resolved in the gray area, in the in-between, in the how do you transition industries which are today highly hydrocarbon driven, and how do you decarbonize them stepwise. It's also what Lorenzo said, right? And we will need these elements, and these projects will need a bulk of money. And the last thing what we want is that there is a financing industry standing at the side and saying, I'm absolutely fine to finance the next offshore wind park. We are happy to see that, right? Because we are also in offshore wind. But at the same time, we have to, let's say, a lot of other parts, which are conventional technologies, existing things, which we will need for this energy transition. And there, definitely we need to recalibrate on how do we measure progress and how do we qualify revenue streams. I mean, we are in the midst of all this EU taxonomy discussion at the moment and trying to qualify revenue streams which will impact financing. There's only one criteria going forward. The question is, does CO2 get down? That's a key criteria, nothing else. And it does not today. So it means there's a lot of things I need to tackle. And my concern would be, we have an industry which is trying to do something, and a financing industry which is, because of their regulations, standing on a different part somewhere and saying, I would love to help you, but I don't like your projects. Yep. And this is where we have to see on how we jointly understand what is really needed to be done. And for me, really, the key metric is tomorrow's world having less CO2 than today's world?
But can I give you a practical example of why this is so challenging? I mean, this is not easy. We talk about scope 3 being difficult. Imagine a finance institution banking every industry, and multiple regions, different starting points. The West thinks the world's off coal. Most of my primary markets, the sole energy source is coal, so very different starting point. By industry, there is a solution, a green solution in some industries. In other industries, it's not there yet. Aviation, we bank. There isn't yet. We have a little bit of sustainable aviation fuel, but it's nowhere near anything that we can use at scale yet, and so on and so on. But so I think we also have to recognize that these, from the financial standpoint, very challenging when you try to apply this to different places. But I'll give you one very specific example. We've committed to net zero as an institution. We're using SBTI, science-based targets, as our third-party vetter. We all march down the path of doing our trajectory setting, our baseline setting. We start with our highest carbon industries and work our way down. So oil and gas exposure for us was the big one. What was the metric we used? We were using revenue-based metric, right? And that was what was conventionally assumed to be appropriate until commodity prices went like this. So you artificially look like you were reducing carbon emissions because per unit of revenue, as revenues went up, your emissions went down. And then all of a sudden everybody woke up and said, hold on a second, that doesn't make sense because we're not truly decarbonizing. Now we need to move to absolute emissions. Right in the middle of your trajectory setting, we're working with hundreds of clients telling them what data we need, and we have to stop and regroup and tell them it's a different set of rules. So a lot of this as well is we've got to have a common definition of what the metric is, what is appropriate for the given industry, how do we come to collective agreement, and then we can help our clients get there because we're pushing, right? We're all pushing and it's not easy.
Yeah. Fahad.
I just wanted to remind everybody that this sudden found pragmatism didn't happen by chance. It happened because of unfortunate event in February of last year. Go back to COP26, and you can remember what was said then. And I think the stance that we were talking about, Europe was talking that even nuclear was not part of the green finance. And now we cannot talk enough about how great is nuclear. And so we need to talk about this. And I think we need to be pragmatist, not because of geopolitics or energy security, but we need to think about 2050. How many events are going to happen between now and 2050? And if every time we're going to change course and talk differently about how we approach climate change, I think we will have a trust issue. And so we need to be very focused that, again, like Christian said, the metrics for us is emissions, how much we're reducing emissions. I think that should be clear. And we should be sure that we include national circumstances. What works in Saudi Arabia with, low population density, with sunshine, and ability to sequester CO2 does not work for Japan and does not work for Europe. And so we need to be clear about that. And I think it's important that we continue this pragmatic view. I don't want us to, in 2 or 3 years, change course and talk about how nuclear is evil again or gas is the enemy. And so we need to be very calibrated in the way we approach, because I don't think we can continue to flip-flop. We have a trust issue, and it's very important that we build trust with the community, with the society at large.
So Marisa and Fahad are both talking about this need for kind of consistency in messaging, consistency of a policy framework. It's true that some of the messaging sometimes, particularly when we talk about short-term, long-term, dealing with, let's say, very short-term energy security issues, and then the longer-term need for decarbonization, can send mixed messages, making investment difficult. Maybe Lorenzo or Christian, where do you see that really impacting your business, and how do we make those messages more stable? What makes you invest over that stability?
No, first of all, sorry.
Yeah, no, go for it.
First of all, I couldn't agree more to the statement, but it also means the world will be diverse. The solution will be diverse, and we have to accept there is no simple solution. There is no silver bullet. And I think, and I agree with you, I mean, prior the 24th of February last year, everything was around just sustainability, not so much about energy resilience, but more about sustainability. And then obviously very simplistically, a lot of people try to find the one solution which makes the world sustainable and we can continue to live like today. So I think the one key point is what we have to get across is it will be a very diverse picture. The second picture is, I think, Nobody knows today on how the energy system 15 years down the road going to look like. We will have to step after step to try out, and we're going to have our learnings. And as you rightly said, in Saudi, the thing going to look different than, let's say, whatever in Germany or so. And I think this is also what we have to accept. For us as a company, it means we have a relatively broad portfolio, and we will continue to have a relatively broad portfolio from gas turbines, which we're trying to decarbonize, to offshore wind, to transmission technologies and electricity, to compressors, a relatively broad solution toolbox, and we're trying to be a consistent implementer of bringing technologies on the ground. That's our logic as a strategy. Because we believe nobody can predict today what all you're going to need 15 years down the road, because it will be diverse in every region and it will develop over the course of the time. And if anybody expects today an answer on what it looks 15 or 20 years in time, then I think it's unrealistic. Right? Sorry, Lorenzo.
No, I was going to just add to that. I think it's important that globally we establish some key principles and truths, and that we all actually abide by them. Because first of all, it's not about the fuel source. It's about emissions. And we shouldn't be saying one fuel source is good, one fuel source is bad. At the end of the day, if you can eliminate emissions from coal, there's no reason why you shouldn't use coal. If you can eliminate emissions from natural gas, if you can do solar, we need every type of fuel source. Because another truth is population is increasing and the demand for energy is not decreasing. And that's going to continue to be the case as we go forward. And the third principle of truth is climate change is a reality. And you're seeing the events from weather-related continuously increase, and it's going to have an impact on everybody. So from a company standpoint, similar to what Christian said, we believe in a diverse portfolio of capabilities and technologies. We view ourselves as being an enabler of the roadmap to net zero in the specific areas where we can provide assistance and partnership within the ecosystem. But I think you still have too many fragmented messages, and you still have too many views that want to be stating things that aren't factual. And they may read well in a newspaper, or they may read well from a social perspective, but they're not practical. We need energy. We all survive on energy. And we need to find practical steps, pragmatic steps around those three fundamental truths. And we as a company are going to be there from a technology provider perspective.
Yeah. I mean, but I think that fits into, we need practical truths, avoid that kind of mixed messaging. But the mixed messaging, I think, can also happen sometimes on corporate commitments, particularly around things like net zero commitments. I mean, I see, many of the oil and gas companies talk about a net zero commitment, but don't talk about scope 3. Right, which is where a lot of those emissions are actually going to happen. So at the point of consumption, how do we sort of affect? Christian, you mentioned we can't just have a silver bullet and have everybody continue to live the same way. How do we affect that demand picture and sort of behavior side of getting into a net zero value chain?
Yeah, I think we have at the end to decide what we want to achieve. But if I want to achieve a more sustainable world, then I have to put a value to that. Today, our energy system is driven by price of supply, right? And I mean, nobody puts a price tag on sustainability. We also do not put a price tag on resilience, right? I mean, we could have had a different dependency on natural gas of Europe if we would have been willing 20 years ago to pay a little bit more money for that diversity. And I think we will have to explain to the societies that this, how shall I say, this evaluation of these different elements will have an effect on the products we consume, right? Because certain things are reflected on it. Sorry, money is supposed to be invested into the infrastructure. Somebody at the end has to pay for it. And guess what? Who at the end will it be? The consumer, we, right? Will be the brutal truth, but I think it's good if this is the world we want to live in. And I think this is where I think we will have to make sure that we value the things we want to achieve. And if I want to achieve sustainability, I have to put a value to that.
Maybe Andrew, that's putting that value not just on sustainability but also on resilience is something, I mean, that you have to be thinking about in some of the markets where you are. Do you have some comments there?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're not going to change consumer behavior, all right? We're not. I mean, nobody likes their low flush toilet. Nobody I mean, there's so many things that we do that we've grown into, but at the end of the day, people are going to continue. People know that their iPhone is made probably with components that might have a questionable value chain. People are continuing to use it. So we're going to have to come up with solutions that meet consumer demands over long periods of time. And we'll continue to be there to try to finance those solutions. So we're going to have to keep up with the technologies. We're going to have to be resilient, but ultimately it's really, really hard to change consumer behaviors. You do it. I mean, I've tried it before in development efforts that we've moved, that we've advanced, but it's very, very, very difficult for us to do that. DFC and a lot of what we're doing, when we look at how we're financing agriculture, of course, there are more efficient technologies that we can use for agriculture. You learn lessons from that as well. I mean, I spent 20 years with USAID, and so we were implementing drip agriculture in Peru, and then you learn 20 years later that as a result of the asparagus industry that we helped create in Peru, now they're having some water stress as well. So we're always going to continue to learn from what we're doing, and it's important that the public institutions are there to be providing the financing so that we have the ability to learn from what we're doing as well.
I think, Phillip, what we don't talk about enough is also the next phase, because you're not going to change consumers. I fully agree with that. But you can start to develop the circular economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's where then you can actually see the reuse. How do you take CO2 and actually make carbon black? How do you make graphite? And start to make it really circular, and you get into the whole aspect of, again, carbon management. And that's evolving, but that's where eventually the technology will lead us to.
Yeah. Maybe Fahad and then Marisa, we can close out with your comments precisely on there. How do we sort of link on the demand and the supply? You talked a little bit about some of the consuming sectors, Fahad, and these sort of overlapping sustainability questions among the sectors. So what does circularity need to look like, for example, here?
So I think it's important to understand that we're not investing enough in energy, period. Whether any form of energy, we're not investing enough. I think the issue, as Lorenzo mentioned, is how can we create some value out of CO2? It doesn't have to be 100%, but some value of CO2. Is that 50%? Is it 60%? Is it 20%? But that can also help to abate some of these sectors, especially the hard-to-abate sectors. That's why hubs and infrastructure are critical. That's why we want to do, in Jubail, for example, to have a CCS hub, because then we can actually have enhanced oil recovery. We can have other uses for CO2. We want to create this, large scale enough that you can actually deploy new technologies. But it's important to go back and discuss, that this is something that, as Christian mentioned, we know the long-term target, but we need to be humble. We don't know what we're going to have to do to achieve this in 20 or 30 years. We need to be humble. We need to be honest. We need to say that we're going to make mistakes and we'll be willing to pay for them. But we shouldn't be, promising that energy is going to be cheaper, it's going to be cleaner, and it's going to be more secure. It cannot happen. We have to be realistic about this.
Can I add something? I just want to respond to something that Patty said yesterday, having worked in this space for a long time, talking about how solar home systems are going to be the solution, and that's just absolutely not true, right? And I'm saying as a guy who loves solar, and I love solar, but the practical reality is a lot of people who work on the climate agenda don't understand how energy systems work. They don't understand that you need 700 watts to boil a pot of water. And 700 watts of a solar home system is out of reach for most people. You need practical solutions so that, and if you say that we're providing electricity to people with solar home systems, they're going to continue to use biomass for the next 50 years for cooking, which has its own set of major issues. And Dami Lola mentioned that this morning. 2.4 billion people who don't have access to clean cooking solutions. We have to come up with real practical solutions. And we need to make sure that the people who are driving the climate agenda understand, and I support the climate agenda, but they understand that you don't just swap out 100 megawatts of solar for 100 megawatts of gas. It just doesn't work that way. And so it's important that the people who are pushing the policies understand. I mean, you need more engineers who understand how this works. I didn't understand it in the beginning. I thought that at the beginning too, and I started getting into energy more than a decade ago. But I've learned over time. And so it is. Gas is going to be part of the solution, whether it's for cooking, for baseload energy. But we all want to get to the point. Every single one of us wants to get to the point where we're using renewable energy. Nobody wants to have to use non-renewables because they're non-renewable. Coal is going to run out one day. Gas is going to run out one day. So right now is a time for us to be developing those future technologies.
Marisa, maybe I can give you the last word.
Maybe I could round out, because interestingly, we're coming at this from different places, but we're all in violent agreement in some respects. And what did you hear on this panel? We heard pragmatism, we heard ultimate decarbonization, and we should be energy agnostic as long as the trajectory is decarbonization. We heard transition. It's not going to happen overnight. No matter what we say or do, it's not going to happen. Climate change is real, so we're going to have to continuously learn. And I look back in the day when we thought ethanol was the great solution to wean ourselves off petrol. We all piled into ethanol. We took all the crops in America and turned them to corn, and look what happened there with the monocrop and the biodiversity loss and everything else. We learned. We'll continuously learn. We're going to make mistakes all the way along the way, but I think if we're all having that common agenda, ultimate decarbonization, over a sensible time frame that doesn't leave anyone behind, and that helps to create those opportunities in the future for people to get involved, then I think we ultimately, collectively all win.
I mean, I couldn't wrap it up better, so I'm not going to try. Thanks for doing my job for me. So thanks very much to all of the panel. It was really a pleasure to have this discussion here. To everyone in the audience, I think we're going to go into a quick coffee break now, but please don't go too far. We're going to have another round of these individual sessions, and then here at 5 p.m., we will have a fireside chat with the European Commissioner Kadri Simpson, which I think is really going to be a treat. So please don't go too far. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.